I've been making a lot of very negative videos lately. This is because I've been reviewing The Flash's final season, and it's honestly terrible. Also, I made that one video about Gotham Knights, and those shows are on the CW, but they feel like it, while Superman and Lois is somehow on the same network, and is miles better. So I thought I'd make a more positive video for one, specifically talking about the second episode of Season 3, which is titled Uncontrollable Forces, because I thought the episode was fantastic, and if this video does well, I'll continue making reviews for every episode of this season. To complete the season, however, if I do end up doing that, I'll quickly review episode 1 since I did not make a video about it. So here's my short review for episode 1, which is titled Closer. The words I'd use to describe this episode are mostly great. Like, the word great is the word I'd use to describe the writing, the visuals, the music, and the acting, but the reason it's mostly great is because the show is definitely very bloated with characters, and you feel that in this episode, and that affects the plot a bit as well. In general, though, I thought the episode was a great start to this season and was such refreshing quality after enduring the recent episodes of The Flash. I'd give that episode an 8 out of 10 and move on to episode 2. Right out of the gate, let's not skirt around it, Lois learns she has cancer, which is a very heavy story arc for them to tackle, and I would not have any confidence in any other CW show to do so, but with this show, especially after this episode, I definitely do. The way this particular episode deals with it, however, is very, very effective. It begins with this silent montage focused entirely on Lois's facial reactions to learning about her situation and having to deal with going through normal life with the knowledge of what she's going through, which was such an incredible beginning to this episode. The acting from Elizabeth Tulloch, the silent acting accompanied by this beautiful music, was such an emotionally gripping start to what would become an emotionally charged episode, and I don't mention the music lightly either. The show definitely hasn't always been perfect. Season 2 had its ups and downs, but something that never wavered is the music, whether it be the uplifting and hopeful Superman music or the emotional, even sometimes depressing. Superman and Lois excels in that department, and this is just the beginning of this story, which mostly continues on the same level of quality. We follow Clark and Lois investigating the Atom Man's newfound powers from the previous episode, and why he was let out of prison, all of which is very intertwined within the main story of the season relatively, or rather really well. The Lois and Clark adventure is definitely something that's been missing from this show for a while now. Like, it feels like this season is focusing a lot on putting these two characters together, and that's good because the show is titled Superman and Lois. Even if it wasn't though, even if it was just titled Superman, they are Superman and Lois, the most iconic comic book couple ever, and what this show was initially based on, these two actors in these roles. So yeah, they should be put together more, and I'm glad they're doing that in this season, because it gives us storylines like this one, which despite having the heavy material of what Lois is dealing with, it still manages somehow to be a lot of fun, at least at the beginning, thanks mostly to Clark simply being very excited to work on something with his wife, and Tyler Hoechlin does a great job portraying this excited, but also at the same time noticeably concerned Clark Kent, who's mostly unaware of what is happening to Lois. And that basically gives us three sides to this story arc. There's Clark, who's just excited to go on a quote-unquote classic Clark and Lois investigation. There's Lois, who's still processing her diagnosis, and then there's the Superman side of things as well, which is all about the villain, seemingly the main villain of the season, Bruno Mannheim, and somehow all three sides of this story are so perfectly and refreshingly competently woven together in this episode. Again, it's the contrast with The Flash that really makes me appreciate what they're doing here. On the Superman side of things, there's this confrontation, the first one, between Superman and Bruno Mannheim, which, if he does end up being the main villain and the season doesn't pivot to Lex Luthor, who is appearing and is a much higher caliber villain than Bruno Mannheim, so it might pivot to him, but if it doesn't, then this is way earlier than I would have expected for Superman to come face to face with the main villain. I'm not complaining though, it's already pretty clear from this one episode. Bruno is a huge step up from Alex Ollie Olsen, who was a pretty terrible villain. The actor playing him played a somewhat similar character fairly well on Arrow, playing Tobias Church during season 5, so I'm confident he could play this role well. What sets him apart from Tobias Church is that he does kind of make a couple good points. He makes some very valid criticisms of Superman to Superman's face, no less, which by the way is a very cool first impression. If you want to make a villain look badass, then summoning Superman to your window and then calling him useless and then telling him to leave, it's a very cool first impression for this villain. And also he mentions how he helps the neglected people of Suicide Slum. Obviously he is the leader of Intergang and doesn't go about helping these people in the right way, but I'm really hoping that Mannheim doesn't lose that part of him that makes some valid points, because sometimes those villains who make some good points and then change the perspective of the hero a bit, but obviously need to be stopped because they're criminals, make for some very interesting villains. And then Mannheim's talking about Suicide Slum directly connects to Lois' side of the story more thematically than anything, where the judge they interviewed earlier goes to jump off of a building. Superman stopping somebody from jumping to their deaths by talking them out of it, or even just catching them, has definitely become a classic Superman moment, but this episode puts a Lois Lane twist on it, which is definitely amplified to enormous degrees by Lois' recent diagnosis, and the fact that Clark doesn't know about it. Elizabeth Tulloch's acting again in this moment, and the rest of the episode as well, is superb. This moment is so emotionally charged and unbelievably real. Tyler Hoechlin doesn't fall much behind either. Again, it's the incredible dialogueless emoting, accompanied by emotional music, that just makes for some incredible moments. And it's not just that, it's also one of these things that I love about certain Superman stories, where he's faced with a issue that he just can't punch his way out of, he's powerless against, which is why his father's heart attack in the first Superman movie is so effective. He can't do anything about it despite all of his powers, and this is kind of the same. It's such an effective story here. What they went for and how they executed it, it's honestly all perfect. I love the story in this episode, and I was genuinely surprised with how well it all fits together. Not just how Lois's recent development is allowed to be intervened with the main plot, but also the thematic connections, mostly to do with death, the fact that the Superman and villainous side of things, it's all connected together, the fact that Superman, while Superman, is also Clark Kent obviously, so it shifts between the Superman side of things, which is the villains, and then the Clark Kent side of things where he goes back to just reacting to the fact that his wife has cancer. It's honestly so well written, so well acted, so well edited and shot and everything. It's perfect. The rest of the episode doesn't necessarily have that perfect standard, but this story alone is honestly one of the best Superman stories I've ever seen. The emotional elements of the episode don't end there either. In fact, I don't even think they peak there, they peak right at the end. There is this conversation between Clark and Lois about what they're going through, and it feels very real. And then there's the last scene of the episode, the dreaded moment at the end where Lois and Clark tell John and Jordan, which is yet again another one of those beautifully emotionally charged moments, carried not by dialogue since there's barely any of it, but by the facial acting and beautiful music, which coming at the tail end of the episode hit me really hard and brought me to tears. It was also in this moment that I was sold on the new John actor. Jordan Elsis was great in the role, and it is unfortunate he needed to be recast, but I'll be honest, Michael Bishop looks much more like Jordan's brother and Clark and Lois' son, and has now proven his acting chops in this scene. Speaking of John and Jordan, the episode doesn't fully revolve around Clark and Lois, and in fact, a lot of the episode is wholly different from that side of things. John, Jordan, Nat, and Sarah separately go to the same party, which is the type of story that can devolve into feeling pointless on a worse show, sometimes on this show as well, depending on the supporting characters they focus on, but I simply don't feel that way here. Like, I think that Sarah isn't all that great of a character, but John, Jordan, and Nat, they're all great, and they all get these moments of development. Specifically, John needed an episode like this for us to get used to the new actor, and for everybody else, I just have an easier time feeling purpose in a story arc that involves some of these characters just hanging out, especially compared to some other shows, because I think for the most part, aside from the Langs and Cushings, and that does include Sarah in this storyline, the show has a really good cast, which also feels like it could be further developed, and then storylines like these do feel necessary even if they are very low stakes. The story is also a bit of a nice contrast, maybe you could call it a nice break from the heavy emotion of Clark and Lois's story, which I think worked well, and maybe even helped prop up the final moment of the episode, because it all feels so real. John and Jordan were out being teenagers, mostly having a good time. There wasn't anything leading up to that final moment, it just hits them out of nowhere, which is how it usually happens in real life. That's not to say the storyline was perfect or anything, but it was good enough for this episode. However, there were some moments that were difficult to watch, like the wing woman moments, which, to be fair, were realistically cringy, but cringy nonetheless. The episode also has a few scenes with Lana and John Henry Irons, which I think is leading to a romance between the two. It seems like that's the road they're going down, and have been for a while now. I just don't really have much of an opinion on this blossoming romance. In fact, the Cushing Langs, like I said earlier, are definitely the weakest point of this show. A show that I also mentioned earlier is too bloated with characters. I think they should move to Metropolis, or the show should move to Metropolis, and they stay behind. The show doesn't need them. In fact, they bring it down because it's too bloated and they don't really add anything to the show. But with John Henry, at least, the storyline does kind of confirm that they're setting him up to have an arch enemy in the season, that being Automatopoeia, who killed his, not Earth Prime, but whatever Earth this is on, counterpart. Speaking of Automatopoeia, this is crazy. Green Arrow had an 8-season TV show with 170 episodes, and they never bothered to use this villain because they said they couldn't adapt him into live action. Even though he's a Green Arrow villain, he's being used in a Superman show. From what we've seen, this version of the character is definitely very different. She's clearly a woman, she talks, which Onomatopoeia doesn't do in the comics, and she has some vague wind or headache-inducing powers, as well as the ability to create sounds, the latter of which is a very interesting power when used against Superman, who, especially on this show, heavily relies on his hearing, which was showcased in the first episode in a scene that I really liked. From right now, however, outside of that power and her cool mask, I don't really have much of an opinion on this villain. We'll see how she turns out. That being said, this part of the episode also connects directly to the main plot. For right now, the season does feel very thought out and connected, and that most of the main characters are involved somehow with the plot, which again is so refreshingly competent compared to The Flash. I should stop comparing these two shows, they're so vastly different in quality. In conclusion with this episode, they've taken a very big swing, tackling a very hard story to tackle, but with this episode at the very least, they managed to create this beautiful, emotionally charged story that's perfectly interwoven with the main plot of the season. Sure, the side stories weren't nearly as good, and are certainly much more laid back, but maybe that's just what this episode needed. There is a lack of Superman action, but I wouldn't really say that was necessary in an episode like this one. I'd give the episode a very strong 9 out of 10, which with my rating system basically means amazing but not perfect. And now I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the season. Hopefully it's closer to the quality of season 1 than season 2, or maybe even surpasses the first season.